Chapter 1, The Order Meets Set After HPTGIF. Disclaimer. Well, duh. Not mine. This chapter has been edited and reposted on November 17, 2006. Severus Snape sat at the beaten circular table in the Order of the Phoenix's pitiful war room of the worn-back parlor of 12 Grimmauld Place. Dumbledore had spent the summer gathering the old crowd, while Severus had spent it worming his way back into the reunified Death Eaters. The last had been surprisingly easy, which left Severus even more on edge. He'd had to hear numerous retelling of the Dark Lord's duel with the Potter boy from the point of view of the dozen or so Death Eaters who'd witnessed it. However, he had nothing but speculation on the mechanics of the Dark Lord's return. Neither the Dark Lord nor Wormtail were particularly forthcoming about the ritual, and the boy lacked the magical acumen to truly explain what had happened. From what he had explained of the ritual, however, it really shouldn't have worked, certainly not as well as it had. Something was niggling at the back of his mind, but he couldn't pin it down. Other members trickled in. Arthur and Molly Weasley and their sons Bill and Charlie, Mundungus Fletcher, Minerva McGonagall, and of course the two Marauders. For now, Severus and several other members remained veiled behind Albus's powerful charms, listening quietly as the others reported. Even Severus had no idea who the headmaster's other spies were, or even how many he had. After several hours, most of the order was dismissed. Only a handful of the most trusted remained, including McGonagall, Black, Lupin, and the Weasley parents. Albus unveiled Severus and the weary man lowered himself into a seat, sipping at the hot tea Molly poured for him. Albus said gravely, "Severus has some puzzling news for us." He gestured for Severus to explain. Severus said flatly, "The Dark Lord has somehow located or created an heir, and plans assume the lordship of the House of Slytherin." His hands shook as he cradled his teacup and took another sip. He had watched torture and rape with equanimity, yet this left him shaken for some reason he could not fathom. Black broke the silence. "What the fuck? Where did he find an heir?" Dumbledore spoke wearily. "Slytherin is an ancient and very secretive family. My sources have only been able to locate speculation from the contemporaries of the various Slytherin lords and heirs. We can tentatively conclude that the heir must be magically powerful. There have been both lords and ladies of Slytherin, so gender is no qualification. If Voldemort has located a potential heir and this is by no means definitive, then he will be able to become Lord Slytherin, and inherit all that that title entails." "Heir of Broken Bar, what is that, exactly?" Arthur asked tentatively. Dumbledore smiled wearily. "That is another mystery." Severus added, "The Dark Lord seems to believe it is something very significant that he has only the heir of Slytherin doesn't have access to. Or at least that is the impression he's leaving. He is planning to perform the rite of claiming sometime in the next 3 months. It must be performed at the Slytherin family seat, but he is keeping that location secret." "Figures," Black muttered. Everyone else nodded their agreement. "Where did you know to learn all of this, anyway?" Molly asked. "I believe he may have found documents in the Chamber of Secrets when he opened it as a student at Hogwarts," Albus said. Lupin frowned. "Why would Voldemort let slip this information? Surely we won't be the only ones hunting for this heir." Surprisingly, it was Black who replied, "The fact that Voldy's just an heir, rather than family head, is a major block to recruiting, especially in the really old, powerful families." Now Severus understood the reason for including Black on this portion of the meeting. Rebel though he was, Black was steeped in the traditions of one of the most ancient, dark, and noble families in Europe. "Straight-backed and determined," McGonagall said crisply. "What sort of allies would those be?" Black shrugged. "Don't ask me," he added, seeing McGonagall's pursed lips. "Amazingly enough, after 12 years in Azkaban and a year as a fugitive, I'm a bit behind on the gossip." Seeing several guilty expressions, he relented, though his eyes still held a certain malice. "Lord Slytherin is a very impressive title, especially to your old, dark families. Keep a watch on those little, isolated communities. Lord Voldemort won't mean a tinker's damn to them, but they may listen to Lord Slytherin. The Llewellyns have always been traditionally aligned with Slytherin, and they've been the major power in Cymru for centuries." Wales, he added, seeing some blank looks. "The Scions of House Slytherin have always been very active, and helped a lot of people. Many families will remember those debts." Severus added, "With the Slytherin lordship on the horizon, it does seem as though many powerful people are becoming more amenable to his overtures." At one point, Students who sorted Slytherin considered themselves proudly a liegeman of the Slytherin family. Lords and stewards made it a habit to cultivate this by offering financial and legal aid, and actively networking on behalf of particularly talented graduates. Those favors are remembered, Albus said. Hopefully, this will all become moot if we can find a way to intercept this heir or prevent this rite. Sirius, do you have any thoughts on what this rite may entail, or who the heir could be? Black rubbed his bristly jaw thoughtfully. Good old Mum was sure that the Slytherin line had married into the Black line at some point if through somebody's bastard get. Most likely, but she said the same things about Merlin and the Loch Ness Monster. The heir could surface in any old family. Hell, Voldemort crawled his way out of a Muggle orphanage, Arthur said, so we should start looking at the darker families for candidates? Black shook his head. Not necessarily. Slytherins have, as a family, been drawn to power, light or dark. If you really need some criteria, I'd look at old families that produce wizards and witches of above-average power reliably, especially those families in which unusual magical gifts or magical creature heritage runs. What qualities might the heir require? Slytherin, especially ancient Slytherin, is a dark-inclined family. What do dark families usually require in heirs? Everyone looked at Black. What? He said. Severus snapped irritably. You are the Black heir, are you not? What were the criteria? Black stuffed a biscuit in his mouth. Dunno, he mumbled through the crumbs in his mouth. How can you not know? Severus nearly shrieked. Black shrugged. No one ever told me. The house picks. The house? Arthur said. Yup, it decided I was the Black heir when I was 13. Mum was pissed. She wanted it to be Regulus. When I came back after the Tri-Wizard debacle, it acknowledged me as Lord Black. So you're telling me that the noble and most ancient House of Black has a piece of haunted, near-condemned real estate pick and choose the family head? Severus said caustically. Black shrugged. Insanity runs in the family. He ate another biscuit. After swallowing, he said, what makes an heir is very personal to each family. It depends on what the family wants to preserve and encourage in their line, and by what method the heir is chosen. Slytherin was rumored to have a powerful guardian spirit, maybe even a deity as a family patron. Voldy will have to take the heir to the ancestral home and petition the spirit or whatever to recognize the heir, and thus elevate him to Lord Slytherin. Can we stake out this ancestral home and wait for him to show up? Molly asked. Albus shook his head. Not even the other three founders knew where the Slytherin family seat lay. The Slytherin family was old and powerful even then. Severus lay down in one of the musty-smelling beds in a small bedroom on the 4th floor. He was exhausted, yet filled with the same restless, jittery sort of nervous energy that had prevented him from sleeping all summer. Yet again, he felt himself slipping into restless dreams, rather than peaceful sleep. The potion is really a broken bar, father. Severus was, even years after being reunited with his father, secretly filled with joy every time he said the word. His father was powerful and intelligent, even brilliant, handsome, charismatic, yet ruthless. His father stepped up behind him, and peered into the cauldron of shimmering, inky black potion. Well done, my son. A long-fingered hand rested briefly on his bowed head. Severus snapped awake, shaking his head to clear of the oddly real dream. His father had been nothing like the dream figure. Sebastian Snape had been a short, rabbity man. He died when Severus was only 7. All he really remembered the man saying was, yes, dear, whenever his mother made one of her imperious announcements. He'd never said anything unkind to Severus, but he'd certainly never said, well done, or indeed ever referred to him as his son. Perhaps a remnant of a past life, he sneered mockingly to himself. Chapter 2. Right of claiming. Disclaimer: Harry Potter has, strangely enough, not yet become my property. Reposted with revisions November 1, 2006. Lord Voldemort watched number 4 Privet Drive quietly. He could feel the wards humming, encasing the drab Muggle home in a cocoon of beautifully spun magic. It didn't like him, but it could hardly bar him, especially after Harry's blood had brought him back. He had polyjuiced himself with hairs from a carefully chosen Muggle. He was currently around 5'10" with grey-brown hair and an amiable face liberally sprinkled with laugh lines. He checked the knot of his tie and proceeded to the door. A Muggle private detective had gathered reams of information on the habits of the Dursley family, including a tentative conclusion that their nephew, Harry Potter, was a victim of abuse. If this proved true, Voldemort would take appropriate action. Or perhaps he would leave that for his son. He walked purposefully up the sidewalk and tapped on the door. The Dursley woman's equine face peered at him suspiciously. Yes, he removed his hat and smiled politely. I'm afraid my car has stalled. Could I trouble you for the use of your telephone? A subtle touch of magic made the Muggle see a sleek Bentley with its hood up. His charm and obvious wealth had the expected effects on the Muggle. Of course, she simpered at him, opening the door. Do come in. He resisted the urge to smirk as the woman's invitation further disarmed the wards. They twitched around him for a few moments before subsiding. The woman showed him to the telephone. He severed the line outside the house with another flick of magic, then dialed and spoke for a few moments. He could hear someone hoovering upstairs. It had to be the boy. The detective's report had mentioned Harry doing a great many chores. He hung up the phone and smiled pleasantly. They should arrive shortly. The young man who answered the telephone had a few suggestions that might help. I hate to impose further, but could your husband take a few moments and help me attempt a few minor repairs? My husband isn't home, but perhaps my nephew Wabroken Bar. She turned and bellowed up the stairs. Boy. The noisy cleaning ceased. Yes, Aunt Petunia? A soft voice answered. Boy, this gentleman. She flashed him another smile. Needs some help with his car. Voldemort turned and looked up the stairs, his friendly, harmless smile in place. The boy who lived trudged down the steps, head bowed. He was dressed in filthy, oversized clothes, and Voldemort saw the shadow of a bruise on one cheek, hidden by a fall of raven-wing black hair. Harry sighed when his aunt bellowed. Quickly winding the cord, he tucked the appliance away. Keeping his head lowered, he started down the steps. The man was very well dressed. He smiled kindly at Harry. Harry allowed himself to smile tentatively back. The warm brown eyes in their nest of laugh lines flickered strangely. Harry frowned as the brown flickered strangely, hinting at some other color underneath. This was proceeding more smoothly than Voldemort had dared to hope. He was convinced that he'd be able to quietly remove the boy from the warded home without incident. That is, until the boy paled. His eyes widened, and he turned and bolted up the steps. Voldemort huffed in annoyance, and then leapt after him. Harry bolted for his room, ignoring his aunt as she shrieked, "Get down here this instant!" He heard heavy feet pounding behind him. Darting into his room, he slammed the door behind him and locked it. He then threw himself to the floor, scrabbling for the loose floorboard. His hand found his wand just as someone wrenched him up by his shirt. The man's hand closed around his flailing wrist. Harry managed to gasp out a few curses and land a few good kicks on the man's shins before fingers digging into his wrist caused his hand to spasm painfully. "Petrificus totalis," the man said casually, and Harry froze. Voldemort placed Harry on the worn, but neatly made bed. He gave his head a gentle pat, sliding the boy's wand into his own pocket. A beautiful white owl hooted angrily at him, rattling the cage as she struggled to escape. For a warm-blooded creature, she was impressively loyal. Opening the window, he tossed the bird, cage and all, out. A few feet from the ground, the cage vanished, leaving a flustered owl scrambling to avoid impact. Off to Hogwarts, Bertie. He closed the window, then examined the rest of Harry's drove. A few sickles, some pumpkin pasties and wrappers. Pitiful. He remembered his own hoard of stolen pennies and stale food at the orphanage. He left the room, Harry floating behind him. The Muggle woman was staring at them, one hand clutching at her skinny throat. "My daughter a broken bar?" she breathed, swallowing convulsively. Voldemort glanced at the door frame, now completely sans door. "It was in my way," he said mildly. "You're one of those freaks, aren't you? Get out. Take the brat and go," she shrieked, her voice thick with fear and loathing. "I require the rest of the boy's possessions, Muggle," he said coolly. He required nothing of the sort. He just enjoyed seeing petty Muggle tyrants dance to his tune. Harry watched helplessly as his aunt dragged his battered school trunk from the cupboard. He doubted his haphazardly applied anti-theft charms would do much to deter his kidnapper. The man flicked his wand again, and the trunk floated after him. The three of them made a strange procession as they left the house. Harry fought tears as the door slammed behind him. He had always known his family hated him, but the man had not even had to threaten his aunt. She'd simply abandoned him. He thought he heard the vacuum start again as they paraded away. Stark terror was an exhausting emotion, Harry decided. His kidnapper had taken the time to arrange him comfortably on a couch before leaving. He'd even placed a pillow under Harry's head. Harry found it odd that one could be bored and yet utterly terrified at the same time. He had been locked in place starting at a blank wall for at least an hour. "Ah, there you are. Thank you for waiting." The voice was amused. Harry's skin tried to crawl off his body as Voldemort's white, spidery hand smoothed his hair. "Polyjuice is a wonderful thing, isn't it, Harry?" Voldemort asked the boy as the emerald eyes filled with a horrified realization. He wished the boy was a bit sharper, but at least his instincts were good. He had already bathed as the rite required. He was dressed in a robe of undyed silk, no part of which had been touched by non-magical hands. Harry's robe was waiting. Fortunately, the boy's cooperation was not necessary for any part of the ceremony. That would have been tiresome. He gathered the rigid body in his arms. Time for the ritual cleansing. Harry struggled uselessly against the magic holding him immobile as Voldemort stripped him. Had he not been frozen, he might have wet himself from sheer terror. Contrary to his horrified imaginings, Voldemort merely lowered him into the near scalding water and scrubbed him thoroughly. The steamy air filled with the scent of exotic spices. He was then patted dry and draped in a silk robe. Voldemort carefully combed his wet hair, parting it neatly. "Now you look like a proper young wizard." Even frozen, Harry's face managed to look incredulous. Voldemort picked him up again and carried him through the manor. Or perhaps they were in a castle. It seemed to have miles of stone hallways, some draped with rich tapestries, others hung with portraits, and still others completely bare. The place was in pristine condition, yet it still felt desolate. He was carried into a small, perfectly round room. The door closed behind them of its own accord. A section open. A section, Voldemort hissed in Parseltongue. A circle of the stone floor melted away, revealing a narrow, winding staircase. Voldemort adjusted Harry with a gentleness Harry found deeply disturbing, and then proceeded down the steep passage. To Harry's surprise, he was neither scraped nor bumped into the wall. Belatedly, Harry began counting the steps, thinking that this might prove useful when he reported this latest catastrophe to Dumbledore. He had reached 483 when Voldemort stepped onto the floor. Soft, greenish light lit the room, giving Harry the vague feeling of being underwater. As he was carried farther into the room, Harry realized that his source of light was water, a large, irregularly shaped pool approximately 20 feet across that filled the room with a wavering green glow. The surface was smooth as glass. As they approached, however, the water began to ripple softly. The waves became more energetic until the water was churning and foaming, slopping over Voldemort's feet as he stood at the edge, still holding Harry. Harry realized that pool was full of snakes. Or rather, it was made of snakes, some as tiny as his littlest finger, others at least 10 feet long. They appeared to be made of water. A large snake dashed itself against the side of the pool, splashing into dozens of tiny snakes, which blurred and melted into a large snake again. Harry stared at the water, hypnotized. It was beautiful, and undeniably magical. But his immobility and Voldemort's hands on him made this a moment of terror, not wonder. The sibilant sounds of Parseltongue filled the chamber. A section, I request the right of claiming, in the name of the blood of the House of Slytherin, I, the heir of Slytherin, entreat you. A section. The churning water stilled. Hundreds of the strange, watery snakes lifted their heads above the surface, staring at them, denied any other release. Tears of terror trailed down Harry's face. Voldemort gently tipped him forward, so the tears splashed softly into the pool. Finite incantatem, he said softly. Finally freed, Harry struggled frenziedly, screaming incoherently. A section, by right of blood and voice, I present the next heir. A section. Voldemort tossed the screaming boy into the pool,